One object that's very prominent in the film is the camera. The use of the camera depicted how everyone sees through different lenses. In Brincando El Charco, Claudia was the main character with the camera throughout the film. That led the audience to view things from her perspective. We were seeing things the way she wanted the audience to see them. The idea of perspective was very important in the film because it's essentially what created the division between people and isolated them into specific groups. Those groups included sexuality, nationality, ethnicity, and more. To go towards the cinematic aspects, this scene incorporated non-diegetic sound with the use of the background music that only the audience could hear. The sound of the music was more upbeat compared to the scene, which was more slow and dark. That part used chiaroscuro and marked the contrast and instability present. It also tied in with how this scene, as well as most of the other scenes in the movie, relied on less lighting and darker colors, which also portrayed the sadness, confusion, isolation, and detachment the characters felt in the movie based on the stereotypical groups they were being pushed into. There was always a shadow casted on Claudia. It implied how she was guilty of how she was homosexual and went against her parents' wishes. There was also the use of space. The room was mostly empty, which showed how she was a simple character. She wasn't materialistic, she didn't beat around the bush, she got to the point and was very blunt. Her whole thinking process was very simple. She didn't have all the photos pinned on a bulletin board, but instead spread out all over the ground. It showed how she wasn't really an analytical person, otherwise she would have had more information. She would have had notes or data, but instead all she had was photos. To add, the scene was showing all the pictures being laid out, and the pictures were laid out in the order of the interviews that occurred, or the people and places she encountered. That led the audience to believe that Claudia was getting closer to her answer, and therefore closer to herself, since she was getting all the viewpoints on some of the same struggles she's had to deal with. The audience was also left to assume that she figured out who she was and where she had fit into society.
The flashback scene that we're about to see is of Claudia's father kicking her out for being homosexual. This particular scene is important to the film as it gives the viewers a better insight on the relationship she had with her father, which helps them understand why she did not want to attend his funeral. At the beginning of the clip, the audience can instantly see the mise-en-scène of a Virgin Mary statue, which indicates that Claudia's family may be a religious Catholic or Christian family. This may also give a reason to why Claudia's father is opposed to her lifestyle as a homosexual female. However, Claudia brings up an important point when she questions her father's Christian faith by him being intolerant of her sexual orientation as opposed to her mother and older brother who accepts her for who she is. In this scene, an over-the-shoulder shot or third-person shot was used by the filmer as the camera hovered over Claudia's shoulder. This shot is typically used during conversations and sometimes alternates between the different speakers. This shot was used to place the viewers in Claudia's situation at a difficult time in her life. The flashback ends with Claudia backing into a dark shadow as she leaves the house. The dark shadow indicates a dark path filled with many challenges that she will have to face in her life after being kicked out of her home. As Claudia backs out of the house into the dark shadow, we can see that her father is looking away from her in disgust. The lack of willingness to look at her shows a lack of willingness to accept her for who she truly is. The mother and the older brother both look at Claudia and give her eye contact, which shows they approve of Claudia's sexual orientation. But they refuse to do anything because they do not want to go against the father since he is the head of the household.
Puerto Ricans who moved to the United States in this film were able to have a, quote, double vision. That is, a reassessment of their identity in regards to when they're in Puerto Rico versus in the United States. The lighting of this scene is particularly dark and has high contrast, coming from one angle, or chiaroscuro, to capture the character's face. This allowed the viewers to just focus on this character. The chiaroscuro can also emphasize a conflict between self-identity versus how society identifies her. This scene makes this character seem as though she is a living portrait a portrait that speaks of her identity, and we see it sometimes from Claudia's view. The woman in beige, her name was never mentioned in the film, states, "These United States would not unite me with my own." An important point about ethnic identity is brought up in that the Puerto Ricans in this film claim to have a colorless position. Thus, Puerto Ricans identify themselves with their nationality. But in the United States, Puerto Ricans are seen as either African or European American. She then concludes that Puerto Ricans must realize their colorless position in order to become a people in the United States. This scene ends with a 3/4 cut shot to once again capture this portrait of her. Alternating with her in this scene was an interview with another woman that was undergoing the same experience. This portion of the scene begins with an abrupt 3/4 cut shot with a bright background but blurred and still highly contrasted environment. In a close-up shot, she shares her experience of African Americans mistaking her as their own and European Americans likewise considering her African American. This insulted her at first, but became something that she was used to. Thus far, both women speak on self-identification versus how society identifies them. However, in this interview, she provokes the question if Puerto Ricans were as equal as they thought themselves to be back on the island. This contradicts the prior woman's idea of Puerto Rico having a colorless position in regards to ethnicity. In these scenes, we can see that Negron Mantaner gives all the intention to the interviewees, with not only lighting, utilizing the chiaroscuro technique, but also applying close-up shots, black backgrounds, and little to no sound other than the character's dialogue. The only other sound that is heard is the noise of the camera, which perhaps can be a sudden narrative cueing or a stinger. The camera symbolizes another perspective of two different Puerto Ricans having two differing opinions about Puerto Rican life and the colorless environment.
The blender scene is making a clear commentary on the mixing of cultures and how no two cultures will ever be fully blended together. Viewers are shown two different alternating scenes via cross-cutting that are in clear contrast to one another. One is loud, outdoors, and bright, with many people shouting, a woman singing, and people giving interviews. The other scene is calm, relatively quiet, with one person in the scene not speaking at all. This is an obvious reference to contrast. Both scenes show an attempt at integration and equality, one human, the other a simple attempt at blending different types of beings. Every time the scene cuts back to the blender, we see the parts of the different beans continuously being broken up, attempting to spin into a cohesive mix and still failing. Throughout this film, viewers are continually being shown how the many different cultures presented, whether national, sexual, class, or race, have not been blended together as much as we may hope, and that there is still much work to be done, and that maybe even then our differences, like the pieces of the beans in the blender, may still stand out permanently. This portion of the film really exemplifies the lack of one cohesive identity that many Puerto Ricanos suffer from. Claudia's girlfriend's interview really exemplifies this struggle. When she is asked to explain her identity and why she doesn't identify as Puerto Rican, she explains instead how her interactions have caused her to completely rescind a previous identity. The chiaroscuro lighting exemplifies how she is trapped between two stark identities, speaking only Spanish and speaking only English. Just like how Claudia used cutting to starkly separate portions of her interview, her girlfriend made a conscious decision not to mix her two identities. It is important to note that, once we are seeing from the view of the camera, we are viewing the film as Claudia, a character, would like for her audience to see. Since Claudia herself is a character of the actual film that we as viewers are watching, the techniques Claudia uses to display her own ideology in the film should tell us something about how Frances Negron Montaner wanted viewers to see Claudia. The director is using Claudia's point of view to give viewers a direct focus into the thinking of Claudia, how she may have herself used mise en scène to make a point about identity to her viewers indirectly.
Through its exploration of the concept of identity, Brincando El Charco further delves into the idealized representation of community. The film expands upon the definition of community as a social group built around shared cultural experiences and the common belief that such a community exists. In a sense, community as represented in the film crosses gender, sexual, and ethnic boundaries. The director of the film brings up the idea of creating alliances with other races through a shared historical connection. Namely, she's describing the shared colonization of the Caribbean nations by Western powers. Furthermore, she describes how these shared historical experiences have manifested into cultural ties, which can be strengthened and used to form a supportive sense of community while living away from home in the United States. With this sense of community comes the inevitable cycle of leaving Puerto Rico and eventually returning. The desire to embark to the United States for the character Claudia was cultivated from her need to find acceptance in a community with shared cultural, sexual, and ethnic identities. In the film, it is clear that Puerto Rico lacks such communities for Claudia. However, the scene with the Pride Parade in Puerto Rico illustrates how those who left Puerto Rico to find acceptance have returned with a new sense of strength to start building communities in Puerto Rico which are accepting of people with these shared sexual identities. In general, by finding acceptance in communities in the United States, those who have previously felt ostracized in Puerto Rico for being a minority within a minority now have returned in unity. Thus, this unity provides protesters with a newfound strength to demand equal rights and fight to change some of the inequality ingrained in Puerto Rican culture. Through this scene's use of documentary footage, it hybridizes the many opinions on community that the people of Puerto Rico have. These interviews encourage the spectator to examine their own beliefs on community. Furthermore, the use of diegetic sounds, such as the cheering and chanting made by those participating in the parade, makes the spectator feel that they are part of the movement. Likewise, these sounds illustrate the strength of the movement. Additionally, the director of Brincando El Charco uses several different types of shots to express this idea of community. Included in this scene is a pan shot, which is used to illustrate the massive size of the movement and fully encapsulate what is occurring. Later in the scene, Claudia is shown in a close-up, which demonstrates her deep contemplation on what is occurring in Puerto Rico as she reads a letter Maritza wrote to her. More specifically, the close-up of Claudia reveals that she is thinking about the connection between liberation and community.